things I've learned is there is God's will, and there's no doubt that there's also God's timing.
Amen.
Yeah. Right.
But I had to start back, for me to understand this lesson like I wanted to, I had to start back in Genesis. And Exodus is actually just a continuation of Genesis, but there's about a 350-year lapse between the end of Genesis to the beginning of Exodus. And I want to start with, I needed to know how the Hebrews got to Egypt. So I'm going to start at the end of Genesis a little bit and just kind of sum it up before we get into the message. Back in Genesis, starting around probably about the 40th chapter, this is where Joseph, the younger son of Jacob, had been mistreated by his brothers. They ultimately sold him into slavery.
Yeah.
There was a caravan headed to Egypt that took him down there. He was put in prison down there for quite some time. And as time goes on, he starts to interpret dreams. Pharaoh brings him out of prison. He interprets one of the Pharaoh's dreams. And Pharaoh finds favor in him. Mm-hmm. And in the dream that he interpreted for Pharaoh, it had to do with the famine. He had 7 years of prosperity, 7 years of famine. Mm-hmm. Well, during the 7 years of famine, his brothers who were over in Canaan, or over in Israel, they began to have to look for food. Mm-hmm. So some of the younger brothers traveled to Egypt. And by this time, Joseph is the prime minister of Egypt. He's the second man in charge. That's how much Pharaoh thought of him. God blessed him. But as they come over, they recognize each other as being brothers. They have a small reunion. Forgiveness is put out or made. They go back and get their dad. Joseph tells the family, or he tells Pharaoh, my family's coming over. Pharaoh pretty much says, Egypt, it's the land at their disposal.
Mm-hmm. Make yourself at home.
Yeah, he said, so he welcomed Jacob's family with open arms. He told them that the land was at their disposal. He said, let them live in the land of Goshen, put them in charge of my livestock. So at this time, there's only this extended family that's living in Egypt of Hebrews. But that's how it got started. And after I found that out, it made more sense to me. But Joseph lived till he was 110 years old. He died, placed in a tomb. That was the beginning of the end for the Hebrews.
Come on, Andy.
Their life began to change. Their fortunes plunged, but the population of the Jews exploded. The Egyptian government became threatened and afraid of the Hebrews. Egypt was known for its rich wealthiness. It was a political country. And they looked down on other people, especially shepherds. One of the things that I learned in this, if you read back on chapter 46:33, Joseph warned his family of something really important as they were coming in to Egypt. He said, if Pharaoh asks you what your occupation is, tell him you're keepers of cattle. Don't tell them you're shepherds, because shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians. A few verses later, it says Pharaoh asked him what their occupation was, and he said, we're shepherds just as our fathers were. But also in the beginning of Exodus, that marked a change for the Hebrews. Not only were they shepherds in a foreign land that hated shepherds, the Bible tells us that a new king arose over Egypt. So when Joseph was living, the Hebrews were comfortable. They enjoyed peace and relaxation and prosperity. But when he died, the wind shifted. Egyptian people began to look at them differently. They began to be suspicious of them. They had a lot of distaste for them and just pure hatred. Mm-hmm. Not long after that, the taskmasters arrived on scene. The Jews went from being sheep herders to brickmakers. And as Zach, I think, said earlier, living on a diet of garlic and onions. They groaned in slavery, and they were crying out for help. If you remember all the way back to Abraham God told Abraham that his people would grow in number and enter a land where they weren't born and be strangers and abused. Well, in the first chapter of Exodus, the Bible says the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. And the Egyptians became to dread the Israelites. But you can't stop God's people.
Righty.
Pharaoh tried different ways to afflict them. He turned up the pressure. He tried to stop them, but they continued to explode. He then turned to murder. He had the Hebrew midwives that he trusted that as the babies were born, if they were male, they would pretty much put them to sleep. But here's some things to consider. Hard times don't erase God's promise.
Amen.
They found themselves on hard times and terrible conditions, but God had already promised to deliver them. And that's one of the good things about the book of Exodus. Exodus tells us when God promises something, He sticks to it.
Amen.
Harsh treatment doesn't escape God's notice. God sees what's happening, and He'll rescue His people. I don't care what kind of bird you're under in here. I've been under them recently. I know some of the others have. I've heard the testimonies. But God will deliver you. Even if He has to split an ocean wide open for us to walk across on dry ground.
Bless you.
Heavy test doesn't mean God's not concerned. I don't care how severe your test is going, it'll never overshadow God's concern. You may wonder where He is, but He's here. I like what Hudson Taylor had to say. It doesn't matter how great the pressure is, or what really matters is where the pressure lies, whether it comes between you and God or presses you nearer to His heart. How many of us, like me, I hope there's more than just me, get impatient with ourselves?
Oh, yeah.
You get aggravated at your shortcomings?
Oh, yeah.
I feel limited sometimes in what I can do. I feel like sometimes oddities floating up on some spiritual cloud that overshadows every test and every trial and every valley.
Hey.
But when it doesn't work,
Amen.
I get frustrated.
Yeah.
You may think, Paul, you're talking about you just getting saved, and I thought of you during this lesson. You may seem unqualified, you may feel uneducated, untrained, undergifted, and even unworthy. But every one of those were qualifications for God to do a mighty work.
Oh, yeah. Amen. You're right.
Come on, man.
Think about it, Moses, God didn't start to use Moses until he turned 80 years old. Most of us, for me, I thought I was washed up at 40. But Moses began his spiritual mission at 80. Moses spent 40 years in a desert, 40 years in Egypt, nursed by his mother, nursed by actually two different mothers, and educated in the best that the Egyptians had. The next 40 years he spent in the desert, taught by God. His last 40 he spent in the wilderness with the Hebrews,
Come on.
nursed by trials, discouragements,
Come on.
tests,
Come on.
taught by the law from the hand of God.
Yes.
But I like what D.L. Moody said. He spent 40 years thinking he was somebody. His second 40 years he thought he spent as a nobody. His third 40 years he spent discovering what God could do with a nobody.
Yeah.
And it was after a small disagreement with God or some resistance that he finally figured out what his fate lied in. What I learned most of all in this, age it's not a factor. It's not a factor. Moses learned late, but he didn't learn too late. Moses was born a Jew, born in Egypt in desperate times. The Jews were suffering under the whip. They were oppressed, hated, misused, and mistreated, and even murdered. But the Bible says when Moses was born, he was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edicts, which is the law. But when Moses got too old to conceal, this is faith. His mother makes a wicker basket, puts him in the basket, puts him out among the reeds in the Nile River. As Pharaoh's daughter is coming down to take a bath, she looks out in the water and sees the basket. She has her maid to go fetch him. Moses' sister is standing off in the distance watching to see what happened. When they bring him in, the Bible says that Pharaoh's daughter had compassion on him. And Miriam, Moses' sister, comes and says, "Do you want me to go back and get a Hebrew mother to nurse him?" And she says, "Go ahead." She didn't tell her that mother was going to be, or that person to nurse him was going to be Moses' real mother.
Yeah.
Even more than that, when she goes back and gets her, Moses' real mom takes him. Pharaoh's daughter says, "I'm going to pay you your wages for nursing this baby."
Thank you, that. Get paid to
That's
raise
God's
your own
will.
child.
Yep.
Yep.
So Moses grew up in Egypt. He became the son of another woman. He had different values, or she had different values, but he's still a stranger and a foreigner in the land. He was a student of the Egyptian higher education. I did a little bit of a study on that, but I didn't put it in here. They equated that as today's Oxford. He was a student of the Egyptian higher education. They were actually grooming him to be a pharaoh. The irony of it is, the very boy who Pharaoh's daughter raised, nurtured, educated by Egyptian ways would be the very instrument of judgment against the same court he grew up in.
That's right. Amen.
You're right.
Moses was highly educated. He had the best military training. He was a trained leader. But at some point in time, all that training, all that he had, he found it entirely useless. The Bible says when he approached 40 years old, it entered into his mind to visit the brethren of the sons of Israel. Moses steps out, and he starts to see his brethren, the Israelites, being afflicted, beaten, murdered, and enslaved. They were doing all the dirty work for the Egyptians. But somewhere in time, Moses began to have a plan. Sometimes we know the will of God in our lives, but it's not happening fast enough for us.
Yeah.
It's God's will and it's God's timing.
Come on in.
Sometimes we try to rush it.
Yeah.
Sometimes we get a little bit anxious, try to step outside of God's will and force the matters at our
Oh,
hands.
yeah.
And that's when it backfires. Exodus chapter 2, I'm going to read 4 verses. And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out into his brethren and looked upon their burdens, and he spied on the Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and he looked that way, and when he saw that was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together, and he said to him that did wrong, "Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow?" And he said, "Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian?" And Moses learned and said, or feared and said, "Surely this thing is known." I actually think by this time God had started to speak. Thank you. God had started to speak to Moses. God had started trying to formulate his will for him. But nowhere in the Bible does it say God's will is for him to kill that Egyptian.
Yep.
But when Moses got anxious to help his people, he became impatient. He made a premature decision that was disastrous, and it resulted in a 40-year setback of his mission. Moses was willing and desired to carry out the will of God, and I think he was eager to do it. But he took it upon himself to kill the Egyptians, and he forced the situation.
You're right, Ed.
There's a difference between premeditated murder and second-degree murder. It's first and second-degree murder. Second-degree murder is usually when it's in the heat of passion type killing. Somebody's beating my dog and I kill somebody. First-degree murder is premeditated. That's when you've got malice and forethought to do it. Moses had malice and forethought because it says he looked this way and he looked that way.
Yep.
He thought about it first. But I think this about Moses, and I think of some of us, myself. We can become so dedicated to do the will of God that we can get a false sense of purpose and hurry up the situation by taking matters into our own hands and trying to force the situation. I've done it.
Me too.
But he looked this way and he looked that way, but he didn't look up. And when Pharaoh heard about what happened, Moses fled to Midian. Midian's a desert. He fled from the pressure of Pharaoh because Pharaoh was going to kill him. Think of the repercussions that came from Moses' self-hurried will. Midian is a real hot, dry, barren place. It's a ground of sand and gravel, heat. There is an occasional bush there. But when he got there, he sat down beside of a well, and I think when he took that drink of water, that's when he began to think about what he had just done. And I bet you he was like me at some point. My life's over. What a mess I've made of myself. What have I gotten myself into?
Oh, yeah.
And can God will never use me now. But you know, in the desert, that's where Moses begins to learn valuable lessons and where God's correction starts to begin in his life. It's where he's alone and isolated, out from everybody else, that God begins to speak to him. That's where his true education began.
Yes.
Because I can tell you this, I've been saved for a little over 5 years now. Probably the first 4 years was like a bed of roses. Here recently, God started to put more on me. And some of this lesson has taught me a lesson. I think God uses those valleys.
Yeah, he
I
does.
think God uses
Yes.
those trials,
Oh, yes.
and those tests to strengthen you.
Oh, yes. You're right.
Like David said, before I was afflicted, I went astray. Most of us, everybody in here, they're going to endure some kind of heartache, disappointment, pain,
Sure.
even defeat and failure.
Sure.
But when we experience failure in our lives will promote obedience to God.
Oh, yeah.
When I'm afflicted and I go through trials and tribulations, times of failure, I'm more prompted to live obedient to God.
Oh, yeah.
Because everything that I've tried to do for myself, everything that I've tried to safeguard in my life has failed. I've gotten so disgusted with myself and the way I've tried to handle things instead of letting go and let God. And the experience in the wilderness brings you to Him.
Yeah.
For God to be able to use Moses, Moses had to make some changes in his life. He developed a servant's attitude. Think about this. He was a prince of Egypt, in line to be the next Pharaoh.
Come on, Andy.
Highest education. He had the best of food, the best of service, and now he's a shepherd.
Yeah.
Now he's watering animals. He'd become a shepherd for his father-in-law. He's not yet doing what he was called to do, but he was humbled and did the task at hand that God gave him at that certain point in time. And sometimes we may have to do some things that we don't want to do before God uses us in His ultimate plan. That's how He teaches us. It's how we grow.
Amen.
Because in the desert, that's when you're alone, and you can learn to do more things when you're alone with God. I do. I like to find a place and time. I like to go to the woods to myself.
Yes, Andy.
And have that time alone to seek Him. You'll learn to tolerate inconveniences, accept circumstances that you've never imagined, and it's all part of His training. During Moses' career, he would be attacked, questioned, accused, hated, betrayed,
Oh,
and
yeah.
he'd stand alone through all of it. But the only way he would make it through is because he learned to lean on God.
Amen.
And when the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in the flame of the fire out of the midst of the bush, And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, and why this bush is not burnt. That bush wasn't remarkable, but what was happening to it was.
Oh, yeah.
And I heard one preacher say, or read where one preacher says that he thought that Moses probably was out on that hillside. He looks at the bush, sees it burning, and says, wonder why this bush isn't burning. And that's when God says, it's not the bush, it's me that's burning in the bush.
Yeah.
It was a bush that was chosen by God. Any old bush would have done, but God chose that bush.
Oh, yeah.
You know, sometimes God will do something extraordinary in our lives, and sometimes we call it coincidences.
Oh, yeah.
I don't necessarily believe that. So sometimes God uses His Word, His people, His events, His unusual events in our lives to say, listen to me, take heed to the burning bush and pay attention and I'll use you. And he said, draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place where on thou standest is holy ground.
Oh, yeah.
God told Moses to put his shoes off, for the place you're standing is holy ground. Actually, the Hebrew word translated holy actually means separated. God's telling Moses to separate himself from his past. Separate yourself from all your previous training. Quit thinking about your immediate responsibilities and listen to me. Give me your undivided attention. And moreover, he said, I am the God of the Father, the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were all Bible superstars. But really, every one of them had faults in their life. Every one of them had sin in their life, just like us. Each one of them had shortcomings and failures. Each one had sin, but by the grace of God, they were used mightily.
Oh, yeah. Amen, yes.
God is the God of ordinary men who accomplish extraordinary things. If you read verse 7 and 8, this is what you need to focus on. I have surely seen, I have given heed to their cry, I am aware of their sufferings, and I came to deliver.
Yeah. Yeah, Andy.
Verse 10, come now therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people and children of Israel out of Egypt. And Moses said unto God, who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? As I said before, the truth is any old bush would have done. But God's calling, He's trying to tell Moses that it's not you, it's not anybody else, it's me and you. God's telling Moses that he's dried out, he's well seasoned, and he's had plenty of time in the desert to listen. God needed him dried out. God needed him pruned away from all the other vices that was in his life, all the other training that he had. God needed him to forget about it for a while. Anything that hindered his walk. And I've been one, still am sometimes, that I think I'm inferior or just completely unworthy to do anything for him.
Bless you, Andy.
And if you're one who's receiving a calling from God, don't close your ears because you feel insignificant. It's that brokenness that we all feel that qualifies you for God's use.
Amen. That's right.
All God's asking is for us to be available and burnable. Just say, I'm here, dried up branches, my thorns and all. Just set me on fire.
Amen.
Yes.